Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.33 From Gangster to King. Before we start this episode, I have an announcement. I originally planned a podcast of 20 episodes covering the entire Bible, both Old and New Testaments. Here I am at episode 33, more than a year later, and nowhere near done with the Old Testament, let alone the New. I always planned 2 series, but had no idea where to split the 2. I decided to finish this first series with the exile, when the Judeans are taken to Babylon in 586 BC. Why end Series 1 at such an odd place, at the beginning of the exile? The Jewish and Protestant traditions end the Old Testament after the exile, with the return from Babylon. They finish with the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and last of all the prophet Malachi, all written in the Persian period after 500 BC. Along the way, they include the 2 major prophets of Ezekiel and Daniel, and 2 also-rans. Why not finish my series with the end of the Old Testament, the Tanakh? I think to do so will be to disguise the great rupture that fractured the ancient religion of the Israelites. After the return from Babylon, the religion of the Jews followed paths that the patriarchs, or Moses, or David, or the kings, or most of the prophets, could not, would not have understood. The Jewish tradition holds that the canon was closed after Malachi. The Christian division into Old and New Testaments pretends that nothing happened between Malachi and the letters of Paul, a period of 500 years. That time between the return and Paul is called the Second Temple period. As we now know, the period after the return spawned a rich Jewish literature, dozens and dozens of books with radically new ideas. All the differences between the different Christian canons are about which books from the Second Temple period to include. Protestants follow the minimalist Jewish line. Catholics add the books of Baruch, Sirach, Tobit, Judith, and the first 2 books of Maccabees. To that, the Orthodox add 1 Esdras and 3rd and 4th Maccabees. Finally, the Ethiopian Orthodox throw in Enoch, Jubilees, 2 Ezra, and the 3 books of Maccabean. I'll deal with all of these in my second series. The books written after the exile that Jews include in the Tanakh have much more in common with this literature than with all the books written before the exile. A great example is the book of Daniel. After much argument, rabbinic scholars squeaked it into the canon. If you think of Daniel as the last great Old Testament prophet, it is a very peculiar beast indeed. If you think of it as the earliest of the Second Temple literature, it is but the start of a long line of religious thinking. Because of the continuity between the final books of the Hebrew canon written after the exile and the Second Temple literature, it makes much more sense to me to finish my first series with the beginning of the exile. Now, back to the story. In the last episode of the History in the Bible podcast, we left David running a protection racket. David transforms his small bunch of ragtag bandits into a disciplined mercenary force when he enters the service of King Achish of the Philistine city of Gath. In return for raiding anyone the Philistine does not like, Achish gives him an entire town as an operational base in the borderland between Judea and the Negev. David now has a camp beyond the reach of King Saul. There are some good reasons to think that these stories of David the bandit and mercenary are an independent narrative strand, and that they are the oldest and most reliably preserved accounts of the future king. First, they fit exactly the accounts of the Aparu we find in Egyptian correspondence with their Canaanite vassals. These are the Amarna letters I mentioned in episode 1.4. The letters were written about 1350 BC, a good 3 centuries before David, admittedly. The Aparu are not an ethnic group, but a social class, and not a good one. They are outlaws on the margins of civilized society, raiding the decent, law-abiding folk in the towns and villages of Canaan. By the time the Deuteronomist wrote, the wastelands of the marauding Aparu had long been replaced by networks of settlements. Second, these stories are extremely unflattering. True, they depict David as cunning and shrewd, but there is no nobility to the tales. David is depicted as out for his own gain alone. The Deuteronomist had a lot of explaining to do, justifying David's alliance with the Israelites' worst enemy, the Philistines. He decided that David only pretended to attack the Israelites at the Philistines' command. Right. The Deuteronomist could not simply ignore the stories because they were so entrenched in the oral tradition. Saul has been hunting the future king, whilst David has been hiding out in the Badlands, gathering his strength and making dubious alliances with dodgy friends. David escapes Saul's net several times. Twice David has the opportunity to kill the king, but refrains from doing so. Here is one story. Quote, 1 Samuel 24:1. So Saul took 3,000 picked men from all Israel and went in search of David and his men. There was a cave there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the back of the cave. David went and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's cloak. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should raise my hand against him, for he is the Lord's anointed." Saul left the cave and started on his way. Then David also went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My Lord King." Saul looked around, and David bowed low in homage, with his face to the ground. And David said to Saul, "Please, sir, take a close look at the corner of your cloak in my hand. For when I cut off the corner of your cloak, I did not kill you. You must see plainly that I have done nothing evil or rebellious, and I have never wronged you. Yet you are bent on taking my life. May the Lord judge between you and me." Saul broke down and wept. He said to David, "You are right, not I. For you have treated me generously, but I have treated you badly. Surely the Lord will reward you generously for what you have done for me this day. I know now that you will become king. So swear to me by the Lord that you will not destroy my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's house." End quote. Here there is nothing morally compromised about the future king. He is a paragon of virtue. David refuses to kill the divinely anointed Saul. Saul acknowledges that David will succeed him and asks only that David will not destroy his entire house. With chapter 28 of 1 Samuel, Saul's story reaches its denouement. The prophet Samuel is dead. Saul has long been abandoned by God. His own children have defected to David. Yet he is still king with royal duties. He faces a mighty Philistine army marching towards Mt Gilboa. He does not shirk. Before he meets his destiny, though, he feels compelled to make one last effort to regain his contact with the Almighty. In an eerie episode, he conjures up the ghost of the dead prophet. Long quote. 1 Samuel 28:8. Saul disguised himself and set out. He came to the woman of Endor by night, and he said, "Please define for me by a ghost." But the woman answered him, You know what Saul has done, how he has banned the use of ghosts. So why are you laying a trap for me?" Saul swore to her by Yahweh, "As Yahweh lives, you won't get into trouble over this." At that the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He answered, "Bring up Samuel for me." And the woman said to Saul, "I see a divine being coming up from the earth." "What does he look like?" he asked her. "It is an old man coming up," she said, "and he is wrapped in a robe." Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed low in homage with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me and brought me up?" And Saul answered, "The Philistines are attacking me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me. So I have called you to tell me what I am to do." Samuel said, "Why do you ask me, seeing that Yahweh has turned away from you? Yahweh has torn the kingship out of your hands and has given it to David, because you did not execute his wrath upon the Amalekites. Tomorrow your sons and you will be with me, and Yahweh will also deliver the Israelite forces into the hands of the Philistines." End quote. Saul's reaction is understandable. As the Jewish Study Bible prosaically translates it, Saul flung himself prone on the ground, terrified by Samuel's words. As usual, the Schocken Bible translation puts it better. Saul quickly fell his full stature to the ground. Previously described as a tall man and now king, Saul has further to fall than most. This story is unique in the Old Testament. Neither the biblical authors nor modern Judaism hold any truck with divination. The attempt to divine God's will through sorcery or spells, or reading entrails, or talking to ghosts. That is so roundly and so often condemned in the Bible, it is a sure sign that it was a popular practice. The priests were granted an exemption. They were permitted the Urim and Thummim. Exodus 28 mentions them as part of the high priest's breastplate, as some sort of device that Aaron could use to work out God's commands when the deity was in a taciturn funk. We have no idea what these were. Perhaps coloured stones. Back to Saul. Before Saul will go down fighting the Philistines, the first book of Samuel spends 2 entire chapters constructing an elaborate alibi, explaining why David, a mercenary in the Philistines' employ, has absolutely nothing to do with the Philistine victory over Saul, legitimate king of the Israelites. You can see the Deuteronomist cringing when he writes these passages. His explanation is tortured and unpersuasive. He explains that, well, golly gosh, the Philistines did not trust David, so they forbade him to fight in the final battle against Saul. They got that part about trust right. By this point in David's story, the reader is clear that no one can really trust David. Quote, 1 Samuel 31:1. The Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down the sons of Saul. The battle raged around Saul, and some of the archers hit him. Saul said to the arms-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through." But his arms-bearer in his great awe refused. Whereupon Saul grasped the sword and fell upon it. Thus Saul and his 3 sons and his arms-bearer, as well as all his men, died together on that day. And when the men of Israel saw that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the towns and fled. The Philistines then came and occupied them. They placed his armour in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they impaled his body on the wall of Beth-shan. End quote. Saul and his sons meet an honourable death at Mt Gilboa in northern Israel. That's a very odd place for the Philistines to be fighting Saul. take a look at my map at www.historyinthebible.com. If Saul were fighting the Philistines, the climactic engagement would surely have been somewhere between the Philistine territory in the far south and Saul's heartland in the central highlands. Mt Gilboa is in the far north, nowhere near the Philistine city-states. Nor is it anywhere near Saul's hub at Gibeon. Another oddity is that Saul's body is displayed at the town of Bethshan. Archaeology shows us that Bethshan at the time was a Canaanite town, resettled by the natives after the Egyptian garrison decamped a few decades earlier. So ends the first book of Samuel. As so often, David watches others destroy his enemies, while he himself is pure and unsullied. And as so often, David laments those deaths. In the first chapter of the second book of Samuel, David weeps for the house of Saul, in a passage known as the Song of the Bow. Quote, 2 Samuel 1:22. From the blood of slain, from the sword of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan never turned back. The sword of Saul never withdrew empty. Saul and Jonathan, those beloved and delightful ones, in their lives and in their deaths they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were mightier than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul. How have the mighty fallen in the thick of battle? Jonathan slain on your heights. I am distraught over you. My brother Jonathan, you were very delightful to me. More wonderful was your love to me than the love of women. How have the mighty fallen? Yes, perished the weapons of battle. End quote. The exact details of Saul's death are uncertain. In one passage he falls on his own sword. In another he is killed by an Amalekite. The text goes out of its way to say that his body had a decent burial. When the Philistines exhibit his body on a wall, it is rescued in a night-time raid by the men of Yavesh Galad, the city that Saul had saved from the Amalekites at the beginning of his career. With the Philistines victorious and Saul dead at the Battle of Gilboa, Saul's chiefdom is in disarray. This is the point that the chronicler starts his historical narrative, following his interminable genealogical lists. In the book of Samuel, the Deuteronomist has told us Saul's wrenching story in more than 20 chapters. In the book of Chronicles, he is contemptuously dismissed with a single short chapter of 14 verses. Before I quote from Chronicles, I must mention a word that can be very confusing, and that word is Israel. In the next few episodes, many of the quotes I use refer to Israel. The biblical authors use Israel in two senses. It can mean the totality of the Hebrew people, the descendants of Abraham. It can also mean just the 10 northern tribes, those who later split from the southern tribes of Judah and Simeon to form the kingdom of Israel. Sometimes the context makes the meaning clear, but often it does not. As I mentioned in episode 1.29, I'll use Israelite to refer to the 10 northern tribes, and Hebrew when I mean all 12 tribes. Now for Chronicles. In this passage, the author uses Israel to mean all the Hebrews. Quote, 1 Chronicles 10:13. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness. He was unfaithful to Yahweh in that he did not keep the command of Yahweh, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance, and did not seek guidance from Yahweh. Therefore Yahweh slew him and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you that led out and brought in Israel. And Yahweh your God said to you, You shall be shepherd of my people Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them. before Yahweh, and they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of Yahweh by Samuel." End quote. While Saul is dismissed almost as an afterthought, David erupts into chronicles from nowhere. No stories of his early life, no stories of Goliath, no stories of Samuel or Jonathan. Nothing. David just teleports into the kingship. 1 minute, he's just an everyday Judean. The next, he is king. The book of Samuel has a much richer story to tell. According to the book of Samuel, after Saul's defeat, Saul's son Ishbosheth and his field marshal Abner relocated to the northern city of Mahanaim in the Gilead, across the Jordan. We know that Abner was Saul's cousin. We know little of Ishbosheth. He is not named as one of Saul's sons in 1 Samuel, and only appears after Saul's death. Perhaps he was a minor or a grandson, rather than a son of Saul. This may explain why he was so easily dominated by Abner. Abner seems to have orchestrated both the selection of Ishbosheth and the retreat to Mahanaim. He remained at the power behind the throne for the few years that Ishbosheth led the Saulist faction. In Hebrew, Ishbosheth means something like man of shame. I mean, really, how obvious is that? In Chronicles, he is called Ishbaal instead, man of Baal, which is even worse. The Bible has no love of this son or grandson of Saul. After the battle of Mt Gilboa, the Philistines have free rein in the heart of Israelite territory. David sulks around for a few months, mourning the loss of his best mate Jonathan. God shakes him out of his mood by commanding him to move his mercenary band to Hebron, burial site of the patriarchs, in the heart of the territory of the tribe of Judah. Knowing what is good for them, the elders of Judah and Simeon promptly declare him their king. 2 tribes down, 10 to go. With David now the undisputed king of the Judeans, he marches on and conquers the city of Jerusalem. While the book of Joshua records that city as already occupied by the Israelites, the book of Samuel holds otherwise. Let's stick with Samuel. In Samuel, the conquest of Jerusalem is a private venture by David and his personal armies. In Chronicles, the conquest is a religious crusade by the whole nation. The name Jerusalem means something like founded by Shalem or Shalem. Shalem or Shalem is a Canaanite god known from the Ugaritic texts I mentioned in episode 1.6. Solomon's name may derive from this god. Jerusalem was a cosmopolitan place, albeit a small place. Ezekiel preserves a tradition that Jerusalem was occupied by a mixed stock of Hittites and Amorites. Jerusalem was a sound choice for a capital. It was on the very border between southern and northern tribes. It commanded an excellent defensive position. If we believe Samuel rather than Joshua, then the new capital was a foundation that offended no tribe. In the next episode of The History in the Bible, I continue the story of David's struggle against the house of Saul to rule the 10 tribes of Israel. I'll see you then. Thanks for listening.